Welcome back. This particular script sat on my desk longer than most. Not because the revenge was loud, it wasn't. What held my attention was the restraint. A girl who was handed a scholarship to a national volleyball academy at 15, then had it quietly dismantled by the people closest to her, and who, upon getting a second chance, never raised her voice once. You're watching historical manhwa. The first thing Jangwei noticed every single morning during that final year of her old life was the smell of rosin. Not a rosin, she hadn't touched her athletic bag in 4 months by then. The smell clung to the second-floor hallway of the family home on Lianhu Road because Jiang Meilin, her father's daughter by his second wife, spent 3 hours each evening in the converted studio her stepmother Su Fang had installed where Wei's bedroom used to be. The rosin came from Meilin's point shoes, a pale powdery sweetness that Wei associated now with loss, the way other people associate it with ballet. She had loved volleyball the way some people love a language. Not the performance of it, not the crowd, not even the winning. She loved the internal grammar of it. The angle of the set, the split-second read of the blocker's hips, the moment when her hand connected with the ball and she felt the geometry click into place. She had played since she was 8 years old, self-taught in the courtyard behind her grandmother's building, using a deflated ball and a clothesline strung between 2 poles. By 12, she was playing with girls 4 years older. By 14, she was on the regional circuit. By 15, Coach Luo Dashan from the Shanxi Provincial Development Program had come to a tournament specifically to watch her. The scholarship offer arrived on a Tuesday in March. Full enrollment in the Provincial Development Program, boarding facility included, with a pathway to the national junior pool within 18 months if her development continued. The letter was printed on heavy paper that felt deliberately important under her fingers. She read it 4 times, standing in the school hallway, and when she finally looked up, the fluorescent light above her was flickering, and she didn't care, because the letter in her hands felt like a door opening somewhere far ahead of her. She was 15 years and 2 months old when she showed her father. Jiang Bohai read it at the kitchen table with the television on in the background, a news program discussing municipal infrastructure, the volume slightly too high the way it always was when he didn't want to engage with what was in front of him. He read it once and set it down. He picked up his tea, drank, and said that they would discuss it. They discussed it for 11 days. During those 11 days, Su Fang made her calculations with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Her daughter, Meilin, was 14 and had been studying classical Chinese dance since she was 5. She was talented. Wei had never denied that, even internally, even in the privacy of her own thinking. But talent in dance, unlike talent in a sport with a national development pathway and documented scholarship infrastructure, was difficult to monetize directly. What Meilin needed was resources, studio time, a private coach, competition fees, the kind of investment that required a family to choose where its financial attention went. Su Fang was not a cruel woman in the operatic sense. She didn't shout or scheme in shadows. She was methodical. She laid out the argument over those 11 days, the way someone lays out a table for a formal dinner. 1 piece at a time, each placement deliberate. The volleyball program was in another province. Wei would be gone. The family would be separated. Meilin's dance competitions were national level, and her coach said she had a genuine shot at the youth championship circuit. The family's resources weren't infinite, so Wei was bright enough to study and earn a conventional scholarship to university later. Dance was a narrow window. Sport was brutal on a girl's body. On the 12th day, Jiang Bohai told Wei she should decline the offer. She remembered the exact quality of light in the room. Late afternoon, the kind that came through the west-facing window in a thick diagonal column and made everything in it look suspended. She remembered his hands on the table, both of them flat, palms down, the way people position their hands when they're bracing for a reaction. She had not cried. That was the thing she remembered most clearly. She had looked at him for a long moment, feeling something behind her sternum that she didn't have a name for at the time, something between grief and a very cold anger. And then she had nodded and left the room. She declined the scholarship in writing the next day. She wrote the letter herself. Coach Luo called twice, and she let her grandmother answer and say she was unavailable. She packed her volleyball shoes and her knee pads and her practice jerseys into a cardboard box and pushed it to the back of the storage closet on the ground floor, behind the old washing machine that no longer worked. Maylene got a private studio coach within the month. The rosin smell never left the second floor. Wei went on. She completed high school with high marks because she had nothing else to pour herself into. And high marks were a language her hands understood, even when her body felt like a machine running on the wrong fuel. She applied to Zhengnan University of Economics and Law on a general scholarship. She moved into a dormitory that smelled like instant noodles and mildew and felt for the first few weeks like the inside of her own skull. She studied sports management as her major, a choice that everyone in her family considered a reasonable compromise, close enough to her old interest to seem coherent, practical enough to lead somewhere conventional. She did not tell anyone that she had specifically chosen sports management because it shared a curriculum track with contract law, athlete representation, and sports arbitration. She did not tell anyone that she had started jogging at 5 in the morning to keep her legs from atrophying completely, or that she had found a recreational volleyball club in the university's West Sports Complex and attended every Sunday quietly, without posting anything, rebuilding the contact points in her hands and the muscle memory in her shoulders that 4 years of neglect had begun to erode. She made one friend in university who mattered, a girl named Tan Jing, who was studying finance with a specialization in forensic accounting, who had a dry sense of humor and absolutely no patience for sentiment, and who introduced Wei to the idea of financial forensics as a tool, rather than a discipline the way some people introduce others to a weapon by handing it to them and stepping back. Wei graduated at 22 with honors. She was offered a junior analyst position at a sports agency in Xi'an and took it. She was good at her job. She was good at reading contracts the way she had once been good at reading blockers. The same skill, different application. She could see the pressure points, the soft clauses, the places where language created exposure that the signing party hadn't anticipated. She worked 12-hour days and ate bad takeout at her desk and felt, for the first time in years, that she was moving towards something rather than parallel to it. Maylin, meanwhile, had not won the National Youth Championship. She had placed 4th and then 5th the following year, and then had aged out of the youth circuit without transitioning cleanly to the professional performance tier. She was teaching adult beginner dance classes at a studio in their hometown. She was 21 and she had a small but loyal following on social media, mostly parents who thought she was beautiful and sweet, which she was. Wei received this information through the family's group chat, which she checked with the same detached regularity she checked weather reports. Useful for logistics, not emotionally significant. She was 23 when she died. She didn't feel it as dying. She felt it as a sensation like stepping off a curb when you were expecting more pavement, a brief, violent wrongness, and then nothing. And then she was lying in the dark with the smell of rosin in her nose and the textured plaster ceiling of the second-floor hallway above her, and a sound, slow, deliberate, a metronome, coming from behind the closed door of what used to be her bedroom. She lay still for a very long time. Her hands were small. She looked at them in the dim light, and they were a child's hands, the knuckles unlined, no calluses on the right palm. She was 15 years old. She was lying on the hallway floor outside the studio room where Maylene was practicing, and from the quality of the light coming under the door, she estimated it was approximately 8 in the evening, which meant this was a day in early spring because at 8 in the evening in winter, the light under doors was yellow, not pale blue. She sat up slowly. Her body felt strange, the way borrowed clothes feel strange. Technically the right size, but the fit slightly wrong at every seam. She had 8 years of additional knowledge inside a 15-year-old frame, and the disjunction was not uncomfortable. Exactly, but precise. Like wearing prescription glasses that weren't quite your prescription. She did not feel panic. She had expected to feel panic, in the theoretical way you expect responses to hypothetical situations. But what she actually felt was something quieter. It was the same thing she had felt in the kitchen when her father told her to decline the scholarship, except now it was not behind her sternum. It was distributed through her entire body evenly, like a dye that had fully saturated the material. Cold, settled, ready. She went to her room, her actual room, the one she still occupied in this version of events, the one that still smelled like her things. Her pencil shavings and the lavender soap her grandmother sent every birthday, and she sat on the edge of the bed and she did what she had spent the last 8 years learning to do. She assessed the situation. The scholarship letter would arrive in 9 days. She knew this because she had the original date memorized the way trauma survivors remember the precise conditions of the moment things went wrong. Tuesday in March. Fluorescent light flickering. Heavy paper. She had 9 days. But this wasn't about the 9 days. 9 days to change one decision was too small a frame. She had lived long enough professionally to know that single-point interventions in complex systems are almost never sufficient. Her father would not be moved by a 15-year-old's persistence. Sufang's reasoning would still be sitting in the air of that kitchen table like furniture. The structural conditions hadn't changed. She needed to change the structure. Oh, she lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought with everything she had. The first thing she identified as a lever: money. The scholarship covered tuition and boarding, but not travel or incidentals. Her family had used this gap as a secondary justification, the additional costs of a child living in another province. Wei knew now, from her years in sports management, that the Provincial Development Program had a supplementary support fund for athletes from lower-income households. It was not widely advertised. It required a specific application filed independently by the athlete, not through a family representative. She had discovered it at 20 years old while reviewing old program documentation for a client whose career trajectory paralleled hers. She had spent 20 minutes sitting with that discovery, feeling something she didn't examine too closely. She was going to apply for the supplementary fund. The second lever: documentation. Her father's justification for declining the scholarship had been partly financial and partly logistical. If she could demonstrate in writing that the program would handle not just tuition, but accommodation logistics, travel arrangements for family visits, and educational continuity, all of which the program actually provided and all of which her 15-year-old self had not known to ask about, then the logistical objection dissolved. She needed the program's full information packet, not just the initial offer letter. The third lever was the hardest one, and she lay with it for a long time before she was willing to look at it directly. She had to change her father's perception of her commitment without triggering Sufang's countermeasures. Sufang was not stupid. If Sufang perceived Wei as actively competing for family resources against Mylene's dance career, she would accelerate her own campaign. Wei needed to be, from Sufang's perspective, cooperative, unthreatening. A good daughter who was simply being conscientious about the decision. She was, she thought with a dryness that surprised her, going to be very polite. The next morning she woke early, dressed, and found her grandmother on the phone in the kitchen, making her morning call to an old friend in Chengdu. Her grandmother, Nai Lu, Aleo, who was 71 years old and had the face of someone who had found most of life's surprises mildly interesting, looked at Wei over the phone and raised her eyebrows. Wei sat down at the table and waited. When the call ended, she said, "Nai, I need to talk to you about something." Her grandmother poured a second cup of tea and set it in front of Wei without being asked. "I received something from a sports program in Shaanxi," Wei said. "I'd like your opinion on it." She watched her grandmother's face as she explained. The old woman listened without interrupting, which was her habit and one of the things Wei loved most about her. When Wei finished, her grandmother picked up her own tea, drank, and said, "Does it cover your living costs completely? There's a supplementary fund I need to apply for athletes without full family support capacity. If I get it, yes." Her grandmother looked at her for a moment. "Your father doesn't know about this fund." "No." "And you want my help." "I want your advice," Wei said, "and possibly your phone to call the program office, because I think the application needs to come from me directly, and I'd rather not make the call from the house phone." Her grandmother was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "My phone is on the counter. The charger is in my room." That was all. No speech, no promise of solidarity. Just her grandmother's phone available. Wei called the Provincial Development Program office from the back courtyard the following afternoon, standing near the old clothesline she had once strung between two poles. She spoke with an administrator named Miss Pang, who had a brisk, efficient manner and who answered every question Wei had prepared. Yes, the supplementary support fund was available. Yes, the application was independent of family financial documentation. Yes, an athlete could apply before formally accepting the scholarship. The deadline for supplementary fund applications was 30 days from the initial offer date. Academics were not impacted by program enrollment. The program had a partner correspondence school that handled academic continuity for boarding athletes. She thanked Miss Peng and hung up and stood in the courtyard for a moment, feeling the early spring air on her face. The clothesline was still there. The poles had been repainted at some point. She touched one of them briefly and then went back inside. She filled out the supplementary fund application by hand, in the neatest writing she had, at her desk that evening with the door closed. Her Nine Eyes address for correspondence, her own identification details, a statement of athlete development need in which she described, without embellishment, the financial situation of her household and the limitation this created for pursuing provincial-level athletic training. She was precise. She was not dramatic. She was 15 years old in this body, but she wrote the statement the way she had learned to write contract memos at 23. Clean language, specific claims, no excess. She mailed it herself on the way to school. Then she waited, and she was patient, and she was, to all outward appearances, the version of herself that Sufang found least threatening. She was helpful around the house. She assisted Maylin with homework twice that week without being asked. She sat at the dinner table and participated in conversation with the pleasant neutrality of a person who is not plotting anything. She was, in fact, plotting everything. The scholarship letter arrived on Tuesday as she had known it would, and this time she came home from school to find it already opened on the kitchen table, which meant Sufang had gotten to the mail first, which was a data point and not a surprise. Her father was seated at the table. Sufang was at the counter. Well, Maylin was not home yet. Wei sat down as if she had been invited, which she had not, and looked at the letter. "I know," she said. Her father looked at her. "It came today." "I know. I was expecting it. I applied for the Supplementary Athlete Support Fund 2 weeks ago. I should hear back within the month." Silence. Sufang turned from the counter. Her expression was what Wei would privately describe as careful, not hostile, not surprised, but the face of someone rapidly recalibrating. "I didn't know about a supplementary fund," her father said. "It's not in the main offer letter. I called the program office directly." She folded her hands on the table, lightly, not gripping. "If I receive the supplementary support, the program will be entirely self-funded. Travel costs are covered for 2 family visits per semester. Academic continuity is handled through a partner correspondence institution." She paused. "I wrote the information down. It's in my room if you want to look at it." Sufang said, "You called them yourself." "Yes." A pause. "Why didn't you say anything?" Wei looked at her stepmother steadily. "Because I wanted to present it properly when I had all the information. I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up if the fund wasn't available. It was a performance, but a clean one. There was nothing in it that was technically untrue. She had wanted to have all the information. She had wanted to present it properly. She simply hadn't mentioned that the primary audience she was managing was sitting across from her right now." Her father picked up the letter again and read it a second time. He was a deliberate man. Not unkind, but someone whose love expressed itself more reliably in stability than in advocacy. He had chosen Sufang 4 years after Wei's mother left, and he had done so with the specific intention of providing household coherence, which he had achieved, and which had a cost that he tried not to calculate too directly. "The supplementary fund," he said. "How competitive is it?" The administrator said athletic candidates from verified lower-income household situations are prioritized. She kept her voice level. "I have the program's contact information if you want to speak with them directly." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back and thought about the angle of the setter's hands and how you had to commit to the read before you had all the information, because the information arrived at the same speed as the consequences. He said he wanted to review everything before making a decision. She said that was completely reasonable and went upstairs. She sat on her bed and breathed slowly and thought, "Good." Not won, not resolved, but the frame had shifted. The decision was no longer in Sufang's hands because Wei had introduced a new variable that Sufang hadn't managed. And the question had moved from, should we let Wei pursue this expensive disruption, to, is this actually the zero-cost opportunity it appears to be? Which was a different question with a different trajectory. The supplementary fund letter arrived 18 days later. She was accepted. Full support package, effective upon formal acceptance of the provincial scholarship. She brought both letters to the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, set them down in parallel, and sat. Her father was there. Su Fang was there, Mei Lin was there, which Wei had anticipated and not tried to prevent, because transparency was part of the strategy now. She did not want this to happen behind closed doors, where it could later be framed as something negotiated without family knowledge. "These are the 2 letters," she said. "The scholarship offer and the supplementary support confirmation, together they cover the full cost of my training and boarding. The academic continuity plan is in the packet underneath. It explains how my secondary school credits will be maintained." Mei Lin looked at the letters and then at Wei with an expression that Wei read precisely. Not malice, not even resentment, but the specific discomfort of someone who has been positioned by the adults around her, to be in competition with another person and is now suddenly visible in that positioning. Wei felt something for Mei Lin in that moment. Not forgiveness, not warmth, but a kind of accurate assessment. Mei Lin was 14 and had been shaped by her mother's choices the way a plant is shaped by the position of the light source. That was not the same as guilt. Su Fang said, "The academic continuity. How does that work exactly?" And Wei explained it calmly, completely from the notes she had made. Su Fang asked 3 more questions and Wei answered each one. Her father asked 2, she answered those 2. At the end, the kitchen was quiet, and her father picked up the supplementary fund letter and looked at it for a long time. He said, "You did all of this yourself?" "Yes." "Why didn't you come to me first?" She considered this. She said, "I wanted to make sure I had a complete proposal before asking for your time." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Something Wei had not seen in the original timeline. Something that looked like it might be recognition. He said, "I'll give you my answer by the weekend." On Saturday morning, he told her yes. She did not celebrate. She went to the storage closet on the ground floor, retrieved the cardboard box with her volleyball shoes and knee pads and practice jerseys, carried it to her room, and repacked it carefully into her athletic bag. She checked the shoes for any deterioration in the sole compound. She laced them tightly and then loosened them and relaced them because the pressure distribution in her right shoe had always run slightly hot at the outer edge, and she needed to compensate. Then she sat on the floor of her room with her bag between her knees and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes of feeling the thing that was behind her sternum. Not grief this time, not the cold anger. Something different. The relief of a door that had been closed for 9 days in this life but had really been closed for 8 years, opening. She left for Shanxi 4 weeks later. Coach Luo Dashan was 53 years old and had the bearing of someone who had been thoroughly disappointed by the world and found the experience bracing rather than discouraging. He had the accent of Gansu province and the vocabulary of a military instructor, and he had been coaching women's volleyball at the development level for 22 years. When Wei walked into the training hall on her first day, he looked at her for a moment and said, "You're late to the session by 4 minutes. Add 2 laps to your warm-up." She ran the extra laps and felt for the first time in a very long time precisely in the right place. The provincial development program had 46 athletes at various stages. Wei was one of 8 in the 16 and under tier. She was the oldest of that group by 2 months and the least technically polished. 4 years of playing recreational volleyball in a courtyard had preserved her instincts, but her formal technique had gaps. Her serve mechanics were inconsistent. Her defensive footwork had compensatory habits from playing on irregular surfaces. She could read the game at a level that shouldn't have been possible for a 15-year-old, and she was not going to explain why. She trained 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, and she was not the most naturally gifted athlete in the room. She was not the tallest. She was not the fastest. What she had was an understanding of the sport that operated at a different level than the other girls, an understanding that she used carefully, parceling it out in ways that looked like instinct rather than accumulated professional knowledge. Because she was 15 and she needed to be believable as 15, she made 2 strategic decisions in her first month. The first was to make herself immediately useful to the team rather than positioning as a potential star, because the girls who arrived positioning as stars were the ones who generated resentment and coach resistance. She played libero in scrimmages, even though her strongest position was outside hitter, because libero was the position that kept the ball alive for everyone else, and girls who kept the ball alive for everyone else were liked. Being liked was a tool. The second decision was to identify Coach Luo's actual value system and speak to it directly. He was not interested in athleticism for its own sake. He was interested in tactical intelligence, the ability to read the game under pressure and make the right call faster than thinking. She demonstrated this in practice, quietly, by making decisions that were technically unconventional but tactically correct, and watching him notice. He moved her to outside hitter in her 3rd week. She wrote to her grandmother every Sunday on the program's provided stationery. She called her father monthly, brief calls, informational, decalibrated not to create obligation. She did not call Sufeng. She never asked about Maylene's competitions. She was not hostile. She was absent in the way of someone who has left without leaving any unfinished business, which was a specific kind of gone that was very hard to argue with. At 16, she was the best outside hitter in her age group in Shanxi province. At 17, she was recruited by the national junior pool. At 17 years and 4 months, she sat across from a representative of the China Volleyball Federation in a room that smelled like floor wax and the particular paper of official documents, and she signed a development pathway agreement, and she knew enough contract law by this point to have read every clause before signing. And she did, carefully, in the room, with the representative watching, and she asked 2 clarifying questions about the exclusivity provisions and the image rights allocation, and the representative noted something in her margin notes and said in a tone of mild surprise, "You've read contracts before." She said, "I like to understand what I'm agreeing to." At 18, she was on the national junior squad. At 19, she received her first call-up to a senior national team training camp. She was not the best player on the national team. She was not trying to be the best player on the national team, because being the best was a position that required constant defense, and she was more interested in being essential. She made herself essential through the same mechanism she had used at the development program. She was the player who understood the game at the system level, who could read where the play was going before it went there, who made the right call under pressure. She was also, and she considered this separately, genuinely devoted to the sport in a way that was not performing devotion. She had loved volleyball since she was 8 years old, with a clothesline and a deflated ball, and that love had been preserved, compressed, and handed back to her intact, and she treated it accordingly. She also spent every off-season studying. This was the part she kept to herself most carefully. During national squad breaks, while other players went home or traveled or rested, Wei was at the library of whatever city she was in, or online via her laptop, working through the coursework she had identified during her first lifetime as essential: sports law, contract drafting, athlete rights under Chinese sports administration regulations, the specific intersection of state-sponsored athletics and individual athlete commercial rights that had been, in her experience, the most exploited and least understood area of the entire professional sports landscape. She could not enroll in formal degree programs while on the national development track. The schedule didn't allow it, but she could audit, read, correspond with professors, work through case studies, and build the foundational knowledge that she would need. She had done it in one timeline as a formal student. She could do it in parallel in this one as a self-directed professional. She had a particular interest in one specific area of the law, the legal framework governing third-party interference in an athlete's career development during minority. This was, in legal terms, a narrow and complex area. Chinese sports law held that parents or legal guardians had broad authority to make decisions on behalf of minor athletes. However, there were provisions, rarely invoked, so often unknown even to practitioners, that created liability for guardians who could be demonstrated to have acted against a minor athlete's documented career interests without reasonable justification, particularly where formal institutional assessment of that athlete's potential existed. A scholarship offer from a provincial development program was, in legal terms, a formal institutional assessment of a minor athlete's potential. A guardian who declined such an offer on behalf of a minor athlete and who then redirected comparable family resources to the development of another minor in the household created, under certain readings of the relevant provisions, a documented conflict of interest. Wei had found this reading in her first lifetime at 21, reviewing case documentation for a client whose situation was entirely different from her own. She had sat with it for 20 minutes. She had 8 more years of sitting with it now. She was not, she had decided, going to pursue legal action against her father. She had examined this decision from multiple angles, and the conclusion was always the same. A legal proceeding would be expensive, slow, emotionally corrosive, uncertain, and would achieve something that could be achieved more cleanly by other means. Her father was not the primary obstacle. He had been, in the original timeline, the person who delivered the decision, but the architecture of that decision had been Su Fang's, and Su Fang was not someone Wei had any interest in spending resources on. What the legal framework gave her was not a weapon, it was a deterrent. If her father and Su Fang ever believed they had standing to make claims on her professional earnings or her commercial rights, and she knew from experience that this belief was a very common one among family members of successful athletes, she needed to be in a position to communicate, quietly and precisely, that this was not correct, and that any attempt to establish such standing would trigger a counter-analysis that they would not enjoy. She drafted this communication at 20 years old in the back of a team bus traveling from Zhengzhou to Jinyan on hotel stationery she had borrowed from the accommodation coordinator. She drafted it not as a letter to be sent, but as a document to be available. She kept it in the encrypted notes folder on her phone under a file name that looked like a grocery list. She also, during this period, reconnected with a memory, Tan Jing from university, who studied financial forensics. She did not have a Tan Jing in this timeline. She had never attended Zhongnan University of Economics and Law in this timeline, but the insight Tan Jing had given her, the weaponization of financial documentation, the ability to trace money and make the trace visible, was something she could develop independently. She spent 2 off-seasons learning forensic accounting principles from publicly available educational materials, and 1 paid online course through a Hong Kong continuing education provider. She was thorough. She was not trying to become a forensic accountant. She was trying to understand the structure of what could be traced and how. What she traced in her own family's finances was not dramatic. It was actually quite mundane. It was a series of decisions documented in tax records and bank statements that she had legitimate access to as her father's daughter, in which family resources had been allocated to Mei-Lin's dance training and competition costs between the years of Wei's quitting volleyball and Wei's departure for Shanxi. The total figure was not large. It was not the kind of number that would move a court. It was, however, specific, documented, and directly traceable to a period during which Wei's own career development had been foreclosed. She made a spreadsheet. She kept it in the same encrypted folder as the deterrent letter. She updated it as new information became available, which it periodically did when her grandmother shared family financial news in correspondence, as grandmothers do. She told no one about any of this. She was 21 years old. She ranked 4th on the national women's volleyball team's outside hitter depth chart, and she was building a position from which she could not be touched. At 22, she made the national team roster for the Asian Women's Volleyball Championship. At 22 years and 6 months, she played her first international senior match. She did not tell her family she was in the squad until 3 days before the tournament, which she communicated via the group chat with the same tone one uses to mention a minor scheduling conflict. Her grandmother called that evening. The call lasted 47 minutes, mostly her grandmother asking questions and then answering them herself, while Wei sat in her training dormitory room eating a bowl of instant noodles that were slightly too hot and feeling, in the warm and particular way of something that has traveled a very long distance, arrived. Her father sent a message that read, "Congratulations! We're proud of you." She replied, "Thank you." Su Fang liked the message. Mei-Lin sent a string of emoji. Wei noted all of this and thought about the spreadsheet. And then she put her phone down and finished her noodles and slept 8 hours because she had a training session at 6:30 the following morning. The championship was in Bangkok. She had been to Bangkok in her first lifetime. At 21, for a client negotiation that had not gone well, and the city in her memory was associated with a specific kind of bureaucratic frustration. In this version, the city arrived as a smell. Exhaust and jasmine and the chemical sweetness of the air conditioning in the venue lobby, which was enormous and slightly shabby in the way of venues that were built for one era's ambitions and have been maintained on the budget of a subsequent, more modest era. She played 4 matches. She was not a starter in the first 2. She came off the bench, which was the appropriate use of a 22-year-old making her senior international debut. And she knew this and did not resent it. In the 3rd match, she started. In the 4th, she had 14 points. Her image appeared in 3 sports news outlets and 1 general newspaper after the 4th match. Her name was spelled correctly in 2 of them. her mother, who she had not spoken to in 7 years, a woman named Chen Ling who lived in Guangzhou and who had left the family when Wei was 8 and who existed in Wei's life as a card sent on certain birthdays, approximate in timing. Her mother sent a message through a social media platform Wei had not updated in months. The message said, "I saw you in the news. I hope you're well." Wei looked at the message for a long time. She did not respond immediately. She waited 11 days, to which was not calculated, just a natural wait, and then she responded, "I'm well. Thank you for watching." She did not add more. She was not equipped in this body at this age with this particular weight of history to add more yet. She filed it as a data point and kept moving. At 23, she was a regular starter. At 23 years and 3 months, she led her position in scoring percentage across 3 consecutive international tournaments. The sports media began to describe her with the specific vocabulary reserved for athletes who have transitioned from promising to established. Reliable, consistent, dangerous in rotation, a senior presence. She was 23. She thought about this vocabulary and found it accurate and slightly funny. Her commercial contract, which she negotiated herself with the assistance of a sports law practitioner named Fei Yang, who she had identified through a professional network and who she trusted primarily because he was expensive, and expensive practitioners generally had enough to lose to motivate accuracy. Her commercial contract with the National Volleyball Association included specific provisions she had insisted on: full ownership of her individual image rights, a carve-out for private endorsement arrangements, and a clause requiring written consent from her personally for any use of her likeness in family-oriented promotional content. This last clause was not standard. Fei Yang had raised an eyebrow. She had explained without detail that it was important to her. He had included it. She had also, by this point, drafted a supplementary document that her father had signed in his capacity as her former legal guardian, acknowledging that the decisions made on her behalf during her minority regarding the Shanxi Provincial Development Program scholarship had been made by him independently and did not constitute a binding claim on any future earnings or career rights. Her father had signed it without resistance, which told her something about what he understood and what he was willing to acknowledge, and how the years had moved through him. She had the document notarized and filed in 2 locations. The encrypted notes folder on her phone was, at this point, substantial. The Asian Games were the following year. She was on the squad. She had 17 points in the semifinal, which became the most replayed clip from that tournament in the domestic sports media, and which she watched once and then did not watch again because she had already corrected everything she wanted to correct in her head and did not need the footage for that purpose. The team won silver. She was interviewed by 6 journalists in the 3 days following. She was precise in interviews, never effusive, never self-deprecating in the performed way that some athletes used as a likability strategy. She answered questions completely and directly and did not offer more than was asked. 3 of the 6 journalists noted in their pieces that she was unusually composed for her age. One described her as formidably self-contained. She read that description and considered whether it was a compliment. She decided it was accurate, which was its own kind of answer. She called her grandmother that evening from her hotel room. Her grandmother said, "I watched the whole match. The 3rd set. When you hit that angle from the back row, your grandfather would have liked that very much." Her grandfather had died when Wei was 12, before the volleyball career had developed into anything visible. This was one of the clean griefs of her life, the kind that didn't have a target. She said, "I know. I thought about him when I did it." Her grandmother was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a person processing something they've been carrying for a long time. Then she said, "You were always going to be this." Wei sat on the edge of the hotel bed, in a room with the air conditioning slightly too cold and the window looking out over the Bangkok skyline at 2 in the morning, and let that sentence land fully. "I know," she said. "I just needed to find the right way there." The National League season was different from international play in texture, if not in fundamentals. Domestic club volleyball had the slightly worn-in quality of a practice gym, familiar enough to be comfortable, specific enough to demand full presence. She played for the Xi'an Tianlong Club, which was a deliberate choice. Xi'an was the city where she had worked in her first lifetime, and she knew its particular geography of personality. The industrial neighborhoods alongside the historic center, the specific version of ambitious pragmatism that the city cultivated. She felt at home there in a way that had layers she couldn't fully explain to anyone, so she didn't try. Her agent, she had hired an agent at 24. Fei Yang had referred her to a woman named Song Wei, no relation, who had a practice in Beijing and who was exactly as methodical as Wei needed, had negotiated a club contract that was, for its tier and her age, genuinely good. She had not simply accepted the first offer. She had asked for the data on comparable contracts for outside hitters at her level, provided this information to Song Wei, and used it to establish a specific floor below which she declined to negotiate. The club's initial offer had been 15% below that floor. The final agreement was 12% above it. Song Wei had told her at the conclusion of the negotiation that she was the only client who had ever brought her own market research to an opening session. Wei had said, "I spent a lot of time learning how contracts work." Song Wei had looked at her for a moment and then said, "If you ever want to stop playing and work in representation, call me." Wei had filed this away. So she was not at 24 ready to stop playing, but the door was noted. The domestic season brought her twice each year to cities where she might encounter people from her first lifetime. From the version of her life she had never lived in this timeline. She was careful in these encounters in the way of someone navigating unmarked ice. She knew where things were likely to be thin, so she moved accordingly. People she recognized from memory who did not recognize her at all, because in this timeline they had never met. A coach from a university she had never attended. A colleague from the sports agency she had never worked at. A girl who looked like someone who had been her neighbor in Xi'an. She found these encounters mildly surreal and mostly harmless. She cataloged them as a habit and moved on. Mei Lin was teaching classes at a studio in their hometown. Wei knew this from the family group chat, where Mei Lin posted occasionally with the specific energy of someone who was content with her life, but aware that it had not reached the altitude she had once expected. The posts were warm and pleasant, students learning combinations, a small recital, children who were 4 years old in full dance attire looking simultaneously adorable and confused. Wei did not click through to look at any of it. She read the captions, noted the information, and scrolled past. She felt no particular triumph. Triumph required an ongoing investment in the target of its attention, and she had never really been investing in Mei Lin. She had been investing in herself. What she felt, looking at those posts on the rare occasions she looked at them, was something more like the closing of a ledger. Not satisfaction at Mei Lin's reduced circumstances, not vindication, just the simple accounting of trajectories, the decision that had been made when she was 15, and what those trajectories had resolved to. Given a different distribution of the variables, her father had aged. She saw this when she returned home for 3 days, the winter of her 25th year, the first extended visit she had made since the one she had made at 19, when she had come home to the particular tension of a family that has rearranged itself around an absence and is not entirely comfortable with the presence returning. He was 61, and he had the slightly diminished quality of a man who had been trying, quietly and without much external acknowledgement, to correct his own accounting. He was proud of her. This was genuine. She could see it in the way he watched the news coverage of her matches on his phone. Not the way parents perform pride for an audience, but the private way, the way that doesn't know it's being observed. He said on the second day of the visit, not looking at her, refilling his tea, "I sometimes think about that letter, the one you showed us. The scholarship." She waited. "You put a lot of work into that," he said, "into making it possible." Yes, he drank his tea. I should have asked more questions. She thought about the spreadsheet in the encrypted folder. She thought about the document he had signed at 22, acknowledging the limitations of his former guardianship decisions. She thought about all of it, and then she set it aside, cleanly, the way you set down a tool when the work it was designed for is no longer what the situation requires. "Yeah," she said, "you gave me the yes. That's what mattered." It was not the generous version of the truth, and it was not the ungenerous version. It was accurate. He had given her the yes. She had constructed the conditions for the yes, but she could not have manufactured the yes itself. That had been his. He nodded, not looking at her. She looked at the side of his face and thought about the 8 years of his life that she had watched happen in her first timeline, Years in which he had been a man who had made a choice he couldn't fully account for, living with the quiet compound interest of that choice. She had, in this timeline, changed the structure of those years. His accounting was different. The compound interest ran differently. She drank her tea. Sufeng was pleasant throughout the visit, with the specific pleasantness of a person who has understood that the power dynamic of the household has irreversibly shifted and has decided to accommodate this with grace rather than friction. Wei found this response both practical and correct, and did not engage with it beyond the social surface. They discussed over one dinner, Mei Lin's studio and the class structure, and whether they should expand to a second day. Wei contributed 2 sentences of non-committal encouragement. Sufeng seemed satisfied. Mei Lin was, that evening, a version of herself that Wei found unexpectedly easy to be around. She was 24, and teaching had given her something that the performance circuit had not. Steadiness. She was calm and warm, and she talked about her students the way people talk about things they're genuinely surprised to have found meaning in. She said at one point, "I thought for a long time that I was supposed to be performing. Turns out I'm supposed to be teaching people to perform. It's different. I actually like it." Wei looked at her and thought, yes, that's the correct read, and felt nothing complicated about it at all. At 26, Wei was voted the domestic league's most valuable player. The trophy was a piece of frosted glass shaped like an ascending curve. She put it in the closet of her Xi'an apartment and forgot about it for 3 weeks because she was deep in preparation for the World Grand Prix qualifiers and had no ambient bandwidth for trophies. She was also, at 26, in the early stages of what would become a significant career pivot. She had been approached through Songwei by a company called Hengyi Sports Investment that wanted to discuss athlete partnership opportunities. This was language that could mean many things. And in her experience, it usually meant a brand deal. But the specifics of the initial communication suggested something more structural, a potential equity stake arrangement tied to a new volleyball development academy they were building in Shanxi. She went to the meeting in a dark gray coat that she had owned for 4 years and that was, in her assessment, sufficiently professional for any context that didn't involve a state dinner. She sat across from 2 executives and a lawyer and listened to their proposal. It was ambitious and somewhat reckless, as ambitious proposals usually are. They wanted to build a private volleyball academy modeled on the provincial development program structure, but commercially operated. And they wanted to associate it with a name athlete whose credibility could anchor the brand. She listened to the complete proposal. She asked 9 questions, each precise. They each derived from a specific contractual or operational risk she had identified during the presentation. The lawyer in the room wrote something in his notebook after the 4th question. After the 9th, one of the executives said, "Have you had legal training?" She said, "I've had an interest in contract law since I was 15. She did not take the deal as presented. She went back to Songwei and spent 3 weeks restructuring the proposal from the ground up. A different equity stake percentage, a clearer operational boundary between her performance career and the Academy Association, a specific intellectual property clause protecting her name from being used in any way that implied personal financial endorsement of the venture, and a sunset provision that allowed her to exit the arrangement cleanly if certain performance benchmarks weren't met by the Academy within a set timeline." Hengyi Sports Investment signed the restructured agreement. The Academy opened 18 months later in Xi'an. It was not the largest volleyball academy in the region. It was not the most expensive. It had a coaching staff that Wei had personally helped vet through a committee that she sat on as an advisory voice, and a scholarship structure that she had designed herself and that bore, in its supplementary support provisions for athletes from lower-income households, a deliberate resemblance to the documentation she had found, in her first lifetime, in the provincial program's archived policy files. It was a practical structure that served a real need. It had nothing theatrical about it. This was important to her. At 27, she played in the World Championships. At 27 years and 4 months, standing in a stadium in Osaka that smelled like floor wax and the specific excited staleness of 17,000 people in an enclosed space, she played the best match of her career to that point. She knew it during the match, not with the self-congratulatory warmth of someone appreciating their own performance, but with the cold, quiet recognition of an athlete who has spent her entire working life building toward a specific quality of precision and has reached it in this moment under these conditions. She felt it in the connection between her hand and the ball, the geometry clicking into place the way it had since she was 8 years old, with a clothesline in a courtyard. Except now the geometry was calibrated to 27 years of understanding and a skill set that had been built and rebuilt and maintained against every competing pressure. Her team did not win. They finished 4th, which was a result that produced, in her, not disappointment, but a specific and useful dissatisfaction, the kind that fueled the next training cycle without creating the corrosive bitterness of a loss that felt unjust. 4th place was not unjust. 4th place meant there were 3 teams better than them in that tournament. She filed this as information and began thinking about what it implied for the next preparation cycle before the final whistle had fully faded. In the post-match press conference, a journalist asked her about the decision-making behind a specific play in the 4th set, a cross-court shot from a tight angle that had reversed the momentum of the set briefly before the outcome was ultimately determined. The journalist asked if it had been a planned play or an in-the-moment decision. She said, "Every in-the-moment decision is the result of every practice you've ever done. The moment is just where all the preparation arrives." The journalist wrote it down. It appeared in 4 articles over the following week, and she received a brief message from Songwei noting that the quote was circulating and asked if she had any preference about how it was attributed. She did not have a preference. She had said it because it was true. She returned to Xi'an from Osaka with 3 days before the club season resumed. She spent the first day entirely in her apartment, eating food she had ordered in, and watching a documentary about deep-sea geology that had nothing to do with volleyball or contracts or family dynamics, or any of the operational systems she managed. The second day, she went to the academy and watched a training session for the under-14 group. Sitting in the bleachers with a cup of terrible coffee from the facility's vending machine, the kind that was lukewarm and slightly chemical, and that she had drunk variations of in training facilities since she was 15. She watched a girl in the group, 12, maybe 13, the kind of build that could go anywhere depending on how the training developed, make a defensive read that was technically incorrect but showed underneath the error, the shape of an instinct for the game's spatial logic that most players never developed at all. Wei sat with her coffee and thought, that one. She went down to the court after the session and introduced herself to the girl, whose name was Pei Xiaoming, and who was from a village 2 hours from Xi'an, and who looked at Wei with the specific expression of someone who is trying extremely hard not to show that they recognize the person in front of them. Wei said, "That read in the 3rd drill." "You were late on the footwork, but you saw it right." Pei Xiaoming blinked. "I was wrong." "Your feet were wrong, your eye was right. Those are different problems with different solutions." She paused. "Do you know about the Supplementary Support Fund for athletes living outside Xi'an?" The girl looked at her. "No." Wei said, "I'll have someone from the administrative office talk to your family. The application process is straightforward." She went back to the bleachers and finished her coffee, which was by now entirely cold. The academy's operations director, a compact, efficient woman named Li Shan, appeared beside her and sat down with her own terrible coffee. Li Shan said, "You're going to do this for every kid in every session, aren't you?" Wei said, "Only the ones where the eye is right." Li Shan drank her coffee. "The supplementary fund is going to run dry faster than I budgeted. Then we expand the fund." She paused. "I've been looking at the quarterly revenue structure. There's a licensing arrangement with the equipment supplier that's structured inefficiently. If we renegotiate the terms and route the savings into the discretionary fund allocation, it covers approximately 3 additional recipients per year." Li Shan looked at her for a long moment. "You looked at our revenue structure?" "I had 3 days off. I was looking at things." Li Shan drank more coffee. "Right. The equipment supplier contract was renegotiated within 2 months. 3 additional scholarship allocations were added to the fund in the following cycle. The Academy's board had a quarterly review meeting in December. Wei sat in these meetings in her capacity as an advisory board member and was, by consensus of the full board, the most prepared person in the room regardless of who else was attending. She brought annotated documentation. She had read everything beforehand. She asked the questions that identified the gaps in reporting. She was not aggressive about any of this, and she was not performative. She was simply the person who had done the work, consistently, in advance, every time. In the December meeting of her 28th year, one of the board members, a man named Ho Wei, The Who was in the business of asking questions that other people found uncomfortable because he found them interesting, so it said, "You run this like a law firm." She said, "I run it like a sports organization that understands its own contracts." He smiled. "Where did you study law?" "I didn't, formally. I studied the subject." He looked at her for a moment. "There's a difference in most people." "I'm not sure there's a difference in you." She thought about the hotel stationery and the late nights in training facilities with legal textbooks and the encrypted folder on her phone and the 11 days when she was 15 that had felt like the compression of everything important into a single narrow window. She thought about all of that, and then she thought about the girl who had been wrong on her footwork but right in her eye. She said, "I had a long time to study." And a specific reason to take it seriously. At 28, she won the National Club Championship. The trophy from this one was different from the glass curve she had filed in the closet. This was a large physical object, a traditional design, and it was presented at a ceremony with a great deal of light and noise. And she held it on the podium with both hands and felt the weight of it. Actual weight, physical, the heaviness of manufactured metal. And the weight was correct. It was the right mass for what it represented. Her grandmother had come to the final match. This had required logistics that Wei had coordinated personally because her grandmother was 79 and traveling from their hometown required a specific kind of organization that Wei could provide, and that she did, down to the aisle seat on the correct side of the arena so that the court angle was optimal. Her grandmother sat through 3 hours of volleyball, and at the end of the third set, when the point that effectively decided the match was won on a back row attack from an angle that required a player to commit before they had all the information, which was the only way to commit, when the information arrived at the same speed as the consequences, her grandmother said, in a voice that was audible to Wei in the brief gap between the point and the crowd's response, "Good girl." Wei's grandmother was carried to the celebration dinner in a wheelchair that Wei had arranged to be at the venue exit because her grandmother's knees had not been reliable for 2 years, and pride was not worth a fall. At the dinner, her grandmother ate 3 dishes and drank 1 glass of wine, which was 1 more than her doctor permitted. Wei noted this and said nothing. After dinner, in the car going back to the hotel, her grandmother said, "Your grandfather's medal is in the drawer in my bedroom. The one from the 1974 Provincial Athletics Championship. I've been saving it for the right time." Wei looked at her grandmother in the dark of the car. "Nai, I want you to have it, not as an inheritance, as a continuation." Her grandmother looked out the window at the city lights, the unfocused glow of it. "He would have liked very much to have given it to you himself." Wei looked out her own window for a moment. The city moved past, its light broken into pieces and reassembled as they drove through it. She said, "I'll take good care of it." The group chat notification came 3 months after the championship. Sufang had posted a photo of Meilin's new studio. She had opened her own small space, new, with 3 rooms and a wall of mirrors and a reception desk that Meilin was standing behind looking genuinely pleased. The caption said, "Meilin's studio opens this weekend. Come visit us." Wei looked at the photo for a moment. Meilin behind the reception desk of a studio she had opened herself, which was a thing she had built, with her own name on it. Toddler classes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, according to the subsequent post. Adult beginner on Saturday afternoons. She typed, "Congratulations, best of luck with the opening." Then she put her phone down and went back to reviewing the Academy's upcoming athlete selection documentation, which she'd been working through before the notification arrived. She had 2 hours before she needed to leave for the evening training session. She used the time correctly. At 29, she was appointed as a playing assistant coach at the national senior squad level, the first active player to hold a coaching appointment in the Federation's modern history. The announcement was brief and procedural in the Federation's official documentation, but it was, in practical terms, a significant structural shift. It meant she would have input into selection decisions and tactical development alongside her playing career, which was, for someone who understood the game at the level she understood it, not an additional burden, but an additional room in the same house. She called Fei Yang when the appointment was confirmed because the contract for the coaching role required a separate review from her playing contract, and she wanted both documents analyzed in parallel to ensure there were no overlapping provisions that could create unintended limitations. Fei-Young had been working with her for 7 years by this point and had developed the quiet respect of a professional who is consistently surprised by a client and has decided to simply accept surprise as a defining feature of the relationship. He said after reviewing both documents in a single session, "You know, most people in your position would have a full legal team for this." She said, "I had a full legal team review this." "You're the team?" He laughed, which was something she had heard him do exactly 4 times in 7 years. The coaching appointment clause in Article 14 creates a potential ambiguity about image rights if you transition from playing to coaching without a gap period. I'd want to add a bridge provision. I had the same concern about Article 14. She had already drafted proposed language. She read it to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's exactly right," she said. "Good." At 29 years and 7 months, she played in her last World Championship as a primary roster member. She knew it was her last in a practical sense, not because her body was telling her to stop, but because the timing of the preparation cycle and the coaching development pathway meant that the following World Championship cycle would require a transition point. She had planned this transition with Songwei 18 months earlier, in a conversation that had lasted 3 hours and involved a whiteboard and considerable amounts of bad office coffee. She played the tournament fully. She was not sentimentally attached to its status as a last. Sentiment, in her experience, was useful for energy generation, but counterproductive when it infected decision-making, and the decision-making required throughout a world championship was ongoing and specific and could not afford contamination. They won bronze. She had 12 points in the bronze medal match, which was, by the metrics she had used throughout her career, an efficient contribution to the result without being a defining performance, which was appropriate. Team sports worked best when no single player defined the performance, because the definition of the performance was the team. In the post-match press conference, a journalist she recognized from the 4th set of a match she had played 4 years earlier in Bangkok. She had a specific memory for journalists, the same way she had a specific memory for blockers' hip positioning, asked her about the transition from active playing to coaching and what she thought she could add to the national team's tactical development. She said, "The knowledge of what it feels like to be in the position and still have to make the right call. Most coaches have that knowledge. I'll have it more recently." The journalist wrote it down. Songwei, watching on a live stream in Beijing, sent a one-line message afterward. "That quote is going to follow you for a long time." Wei sent back, "Good." The Xi'an Tianlong Club had a celebration dinner for her in the off-season, a table in a private room of a restaurant that served Shanxi specialties on large communal plates, the kind of food that was designed to be passed around and argued over. Her teammates, who ranged in age from 19 to 31, were people she had spent years working with closely enough to know their service mechanics, their defensive habits, their responses to pressure, their favorite pre-match routines. She knew them the way you know people you have been in difficulty with, from the inside out. They ate and talked, and someone proposed a toast, using language that was mildly embarrassing and entirely sincere. And she accepted it without deflection because deflecting sincere things was not useful. And then she changed the subject to the upcoming season's tactical preparation, and they argued productively for 40 minutes about setter positioning, which was exactly the right way to end the evening. She was at the academy the next morning at 6:45. Li Shan was already there. There was terrible coffee. Pei Xiaoming, now 16 and the most improved under-17 athlete in the program's 2nd year, was running warm-up laps with a focused look that Wei recognized as belonging specifically to athletes who had decided to take themselves seriously. She watched Pei Xiaoming run for a moment and thought about the clippered, efficient way the girl had reorganized her footwork over the past 18 months, the way the eye and the feet were now arriving at the same places at the same time. The instinct and the technique beginning to function as a single system rather than 2 separate things. She thought about a deflated ball and a clothesline between 2 poles. She went inside and poured herself the terrible coffee and sat down with the athletic development reports for the current intake cycle. She had notes from the previous session. She had analysis to review. There were 3 athletes in the under-15 group whose supplementary fund applications needed to be cross-checked against the fund's current balance. Li Shan had flagged a potential scheduling conflict with the spring assessment period. She opened the relevant files. She picked up her pen. Outside the window, the early morning light was doing what early morning light does in Xi'an in late winter. arriving slowly, the way things arrive when they are prepared for it, they building from the horizon with the deliberate quality of something that has made a plan and is executing it without impatience. She began to work. Her phone, face up beside the coffee cup, lit briefly with a notification from the family group chat. A photo. Maylene's studio, a Tuesday morning class, 4 toddlers in pink leotards mid-movement, arms flung outward in various directions, each of them engaged in a completely different interpretation of what the music was asking for. Maylene was visible in the reflection of the mirrors, hands raised in demonstration, smiling. Wei looked at the photo. One of the toddlers had fallen over and appeared unbothered by this. Another had given up entirely on the choreography and was examining something on the floor with scientific focus. She put the phone back face down and returned to the athletic development reports. Li Shan appeared in the doorway with her own coffee. That the Shanxi qualifier review? Under 15 intake. With 3 supplementary fund applications. She didn't look up. The fund balance needs a conversation. I know. I was going to bring it up this week. I have a proposal for the equipment supplier revenue restructuring. Again. Li Shan drank her coffee. How often are you going to reorganize this budget? As often as necessary. Outside, Pei Xiaoming finished her warm-up laps and was beginning to set up for the morning's first drill sequence. Wei could hear her from the window. The authoritative slap of the ball against the court surface, the sound of footwork adjustments, the brief consultation with the assistant coach about angle positioning. The sound was the same as it had always been, clean and specific. The grammar of the game she had been speaking since she was 8 years old in a courtyard. She wrote a note in the margin of the intake review. Supplementary fund. Renegotiate equipment contract prior to Q2 distribution. She underlined it once. She moved on to the next file.